Hey guys, welcome back to Home Built, and now the engine and gearbox is mounted where it's supposed to be. I need to try and work out how I'm going to steer it. Alright, so those of you watching last week will have seen that the engine and gearbox is mounted and it's really tight in that engine bay. And basically what I have laid out here now is the factory Alfa front end suspension setup. So we've got the suspension arms from both sides, and we've also got the factory steering column and steering box. So on this car, as opposed to most modern cars, this actually has a steering box setup as opposed to most modern cars which have a steering rack. What it essentially has this box here has a gear drive in it that just sort of moves this arm backwards and forwards, and this is the steering. So there was this in the engine bay in the back corner, and that on the other side of the engine bay, so that were basically, they took up a lot of space, and there is definitely not any room for that in the car. So what I need to start looking at is an alternative that is not going to take up this much room. So this got me thinking, and I actually went down to M&I Spares, which is a Toyota wrecker, and I got myself a Toyota Corolla steering rack. I searched high and low for a steering rack that would be the right size for my purposes, and I'm not sure even exactly what car this is off of. I believe it's mid-90s Toyota Corolla, non-power steering rack, which is what I was looking for, and this is about the right size. Now, you need to consider a lot of things when you start changing steering on a car, and I'll go through that in a bit more detail later, but this is the one for me, and it's set up nicely. And the reason I went for Toyota particularly is because these the splines on the Toyotas stayed the same forever, and they come in all different lengths and sizes, so I should be able to chop and change with factory parts without having to cut anything. I should be able to get this in the car, sitting there nice and securely, and do the job I'm looking for. While I was there, I also got myself a beautiful steering wheel. How nice is that? That is going to fit the car beautifully. But in all seriousness, this is a telescopic collapsible steering shaft with obviously the Toyota splines on the end, and it's also got the key and the lock mechanism and all that sort of stuff that I can reuse. I can get rid of the Toyota bits, and this will be a good addition to the car. So the first thing I need to do is I need to go through and start cleaning up some of this old suspension stuff so that I can actually put it back in the car, because I need it all in the car to work all this stuff out. Okay, so I gave the suspension components a quick tidy up. I will be using the basic suspension geometry on the car. That will be remaining, but obviously I'm going to be upgrading that suspension. Also, I'll be obviously upgrading the brakes, but for the time being, this is what I need to be able to sort out the steering. So I'm going to bolt these back in now, and then we can start playing around and work out what I'm going to do to get this thing to steer. So the suspension is all back in the car on both sides. It moves up and down. It's got the shock on it, but that moves through its normal arc of travel. So that's the way I need that. But to put the steering rack in, I basically, you can see here, this is the original tie rod, and it's interfering with this upright, which is actually what's holding this whole structure together. So I have to remove these or move these out of the way. So what I'm thinking is I'll actually move this front frame over to this hole over here and remount the car over there. That does mean though that I have to take the engine and gearbox out again, and that will keep the ball rolling. So let's get onto it. Okay, well, my steering rack is mounted in on the other side, but on this side I can't actually get this tie rod end out of the original sort of tie rod. So I'm going to take this piece off and put it in the press, but I want to take this piece off anyway, and I'll show you why in a little bit. So let's get this off and see if we can get this end out. I've tried heat, I've tried soaking it overnight with some penetrating fluid, and it still doesn't want to come. So I think the press is the way to go, and we will get this thing out. Far out, that was tight. Wow, that let go with a bang. That was really tight. I'll just quickly mock this up, and I'll start talking you through and showing you through my ideas with the steering rack. Okay, so you can see through here, and I've got the steering rack loosely mounted up, so it's going to sit up something like that. And there are two things that you need to be extremely critical of when you start playing around with steering. There is, and that is bump steer and Ackerman. And I'll run through them quickly now. All right, so I am far from an expert on any of this, but basically one of the things you need to think about is Ackerman. And this is a very rough, dodgy diagram I did on what Ackerman is. And basically what we're talking about here is these front wheels of a car. Whenever you turn a corner, the inside wheel is obviously turning tighter radius than the outside wheel. So generally you need to set up your Ackerman so that when you turn one way, the inside wheel turns more than the outside, but then when it goes the other way, the opposite wheel is then turning more than the other. That is what Ackerman is all about. And generally what you're trying to do is, if you do a straight line through your rear axle all the way down to a imaginary point, and a straight line perpendicular to your front tyre on one side, the other tyre on the other side should also go with that. That way you don't get your tyres scrubbing out when you're going around a corner, because they're going around the same bend, if that makes any sense. So that is Ackerman. That is actually set up and it should be pretty much unchanged, because most of the way the Ackerman is set up is when you've got your wheel and your hub, where the steering connects on is usually on an angle backwards slightly, and it's that angle that really sets up your Ackerman, and that angle is what, in relation to the steering arm, that is how you get your Ackerman on the car, and that is something that I am not going to touch and change really. The next thing I need to talk about is bump steer. Now, bump steer is something that you do have to be quite careful about, particularly because I'm moving the steering rack. I am going to be affecting bump steer on this car. If you imagine that here's your tyre, here is here's your stub axle, and here's the mounting point on the back of the wheel. This is your suspension arm. So that's your upper suspension arm and your lower suspension arm. These are fixed points on the car. They stay solid. And if you can imagine, as you go up and down, as the wheel sort of travels up and down along the suspension travel, the upper and lower arms sort of travel in an arc. And that means that the wheel actually does travel a bit like that as it goes up and down. And generally the top suspension arm is a little bit shorter, so that you get a little bit of camber as the wheel goes up into the wheel arch. As the suspension compresses, it means it gets a little bit more. Generally, it's because you're turning and it's getting a bit more contact on the road. That's the basic layer, and this here is the steering arm. Now, if you can imagine, while this wheel is traveling up and down, the steering arm is also traveling in an arc. Now, if it doesn't match with what the suspension's doing, it could actually, as the steering goes up and down, it could pull the wheel, either pull the wheel, steer the wheel in or steer the wheel out if it doesn't match up. That's why it's quite critical. Now, I am lowering my steering rack down to a lower point than what it originally was because I can't put it where it originally was. If I connected that up like that, that means that the arc it's traveling is not similar to what the other wheels are. And as it goes up in the suspension, it's going to be pulling that wheel inwards and actually throwing the steering out quite a lot. Now, what I'm going to be doing is with that little arm that I just pulled off, I'm going to be flipping it upside down and mounting it lower so that we keep a similar steering angle. Now, it's also, when I bought this steering rack, I was looking for a steering rack that had a similar pivot points to what the original had, because I wanted the distance to stay the same, because I wanted this distance to be matching what the factory had, because otherwise bump steer can be all over the place, and then suddenly every time you go over a bump, the car wants to tear you off the road, and that's not safe, and that is something I am concerned about. So hopefully I haven't completely confused you, but that's roughly what bump steer is. All right, so this is roughly where I want the steering rack to end up. And before I actually get to mounting it in securely, what I need to do is I need to make sure everything fits, everything clears, and everything is aligned the way I want it to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I've got a couple of these bits of angle iron here. I'm going to just tack them onto the bottom of the subframe here so that I can sort of space and rest this steering rack in the right spot, make sure everything clears, and then I can weld it in for good. Okay, so now I've got the rack roughly where I want it to be. The tie rods are too long currently, so the wheels are poking in. What I need to do, there's extra thread on this tie rod here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tie rod ends off. I'm going to trim them back so that I can actually hopefully get some sort of reasonably straight steering. I'm not aligning it or going crazy. I just want it so that they look roughly in the right spot. And then I'll put them back together again. This tie rod is bent. I'm going to replace it later. I'm not that worried about it. I just want to get it pretty close for the time being. I've just set this up here temporarily. I've clamped in the back there. I've clamped the steering rack down to those bars that I welded in, and I've connected up my tie rod just up here, and I've set up my jack so it can jack up underneath the wheel, take it up to full ride height and down, and I've just set up my laser up on here, and over this end of the workshop I've set up a board so you can actually see where the laser travels. And at the moment you can see how bad the bump steer is, because the bump steer at the moment is horrible. So I'll turn the laser on. Now at the moment, if you can see that laser, this is showing you how absolutely horrible bump steer is. So as I'm jacking the car up, the laser is moving, and it pretty much starts moving horizontally. That's supposed to be going up and down, and it's going side to side. So that is really, really bad bump steer. That's extremely bad bump steer. Okay, so to try and rectify this bump steer issue at the moment, what I need to do is I need to take this arm off of the off of the back of here. I can take it off, but I can't. To put it back on again, these bolts I need to be able to access, which are behind the disc. So I have to take the disc and disassemble the front hub assembly. So let's do that on both sides. Swap these arms over and see if it makes a difference. Alright, so I managed to get the disc off eventually. I had to actually grind down the lip on the edge of the disc. It had worn down so much that I couldn't get the pads off. It was being a real pain, so I had to grind the lip off, and then it came off reasonably easily. So while I'm in here, it's a good time to mention one of the guys watching this show, Colin Byrne, actually, he has raced an Alfa 105 tarmac rally car and won a lot of events in Australia in tarmac rallies in these, and has had issues with the front splines of these. After a lot of work, he actually developed these bushings basically. So these slide on over here like this, opposed to what you would normally do with a bearing by tightening it up until you can just feel it moving and then back it off just a little bit. This, you can tighten it up all the way and crank it up as hard as you like. This takes all of the slop out from inside between the hub and the splines. So they're a really cool piece of gear. He also has a YouTube channel which I highly recommend. I've been watching his series on. He's got a Lancia Stratos replica that he is replacing the engine and putting a V6 Alfa Busso engine into, and he does really high level machining stuff in his garage. It's well worth watching. I'll put a link in the description so you can go and check his stuff out, because I'm really enjoying it. So yeah, he actually did a similar rack conversion on his car, and that's where I'm getting a lot of the ideas stolen from what he did to set up on mine. So I'm going to swap these arms over now, and yeah, we can keep moving forward. Alright, so I've been going backwards and forwards for a bit now, trying to get the correct angles for my bump steer to actually work. And what I've found is that if I put the tie rod in the way it's supposed to go, because this is a tapered fit, on the top end of the steering knuckle here, I can't get decent anywhere close to good bump steer. But if I put it in underneath, it seems to be much better. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to get rid of these as my tie rod ends. I mean, they need replacing anyway, and I'll have to order the correct size. At the moment, I managed to go and get some rose joints, so I'm going to use some rose joints instead and have rose jointed suspension, which is an upgrade a lot of people do anyway. It's a lot harsher. It takes out the normal tie rod ends have got a little bit more cushioning in them. These are very direct and firm, but they should do the job nicely. And what I'm going to need to do is bolt them in from underneath and see how that goes, and give that a try and see if I can use that as my tie rod ends. Okay, so hopefully the camera picked that up, but in that position, I finally have almost perfect bump steer. The line does wave very slightly, but it is so insignificant, and we're talking about a distance of, I'd say, 3 meters to where that board is, and it was moving maybe 20 or 30 mil over 3 meters, so it's a very small amount that we're talking. I'm calling that a win. So we now have the rack in a position that works, but now I need to try and put the engine back in as it sits. So that's the next challenge. All right, well, the engine is mostly bolted in. I haven't quite got in the back edge of the bolt on this side, but you can see that the steering rack is clear. Only just, but that's all I need, is just. Now down under here is a different situation. So basically, here's the steering rack here, here's the back of the adapter plate. The bolt that goes through the adapter plate, through the case of the block, is touching this boss here on the steering rack. I mean, this is just a locating boss, so I can actually trim this out or make it to fit, and I can also change the bolt that I've got into there to give me a little bit more space. Here's where the steering shaft exits and goes up. So I'll just have a look at that now from the car side, but I think we can have just enough room to make it work. All right, guys, well, as always, that took way longer than I thought it was going to, but I believe I have finally sorted it out, and we have the steering rack that is going to work in the car. We are going to have enough room. As I said, it's all tight tolerances. This engine is still far too big for this car, but it fits, and we can move forward. We're going to have a nice steering setup without bump steer. That is a very important thing. Now, I still have lots more to do. I've still got to obviously mount that rack, and I've got to chase up and get some more rose joints and things like that, but that is a relief. So I think that means it's time for Fun Facts with Mrs. Jeff.
In 1976, the Alfa Romeo Alfa Sud Sprint was introduced at the Turin Motor Show. Like the Alfa Sud, it was designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, and it was based on the Alfa Sud mechanicals, but it had a lower, more angular design and a hatchback. It featured a 1.3 litre flat-4 engine, producing 75 horsepower. In 1979, the bigger 1.5 litre 95 horsepower producing engine was introduced to the lineup for the Alfa Sud Sprint Veloce. Then in 1983, Alfa Romeo had a range facelift, and the name went from the Alfa Sud Sprint Veloce to just the Sprint. Both the 1.3 litre and 1.5 litre versions remained, but the 1.5 litre Quadrifoglio Verde was introduced with 105 horsepower and green striping. The QV engine was upgraded again in 1987 to 1.7 litres and 116 horsepower. In total, 116,000 sprints were produced during its lifespan.
All right, we're making progress. We're getting there, and the steering is going to fit, which is a big win because yeah, there's not a lot of space, but I reckon I can make it work, which is a big win.
I mean, it kind of worries me when you're like, I'm just going to make it work, even if it doesn't fit.
It'll work. I'll make it work. If Pinky can fit all that stuff in that tiny little Mini, I can fit this in here. All right, well, as always, if you want to help us out and keep supporting this crazy build, join us on Patreon. It really does help, and you get to watch the videos a day before everyone else.
Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. We really like hearing what you think.
Yep.
Really good.
We read all the comments. All right, guys. We'll see you next time.
See you guys. More angular, flat design with a hatchback. Mechanicals. Oh, stop it. And a hatchback. Nice. In 95, 7 litres and 117.